Oh, hello, everybody. Welcome to the 17th ICLASP meeting. I am Sikong Eng. It is my honor to be a part of the meeting. I thank Professor Benedict Watson, Professor Liz Jones, and the conference committee for the invitation to be a keynote speaker. The committee and support team at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University has persisted to ensure ICLASP can continue meeting in these difficult times. Thank you, Amos and Nova. The topic of my talk is nonviolent collective actions and genuine dialogue. In preparing the talk, I have received encouragement and comments from Grace, Tina, John, Tingin, Raymond, Jim, and Nitesh. Thank you all. Collective action has affected us and will continue to do so. Many of us will have taken part in it or known people who do, whether in collecting signatures for a petition, joining a sit-in, or taking to the streets in a protest march. I'll begin with some introductory remarks of collective action. This will lead us to three major issues summarized in the slide as parts B, C, and D. The collective action is possible only if people participate in it. Why do some but not others? Some CAs may proceed smoothly, others may go wrong and erupt into violence. Why? And what can be done about it? These issues will be discussed from a social psychological perspective, broadly defined to include micro-sociology. As we go through these issues, we shall come across impressive advances in theoretical integration and exciting opportunities for further research. Part D will focus on genuine dialogue, how it may facilitate the goals of CAs for the common good. The discussions will draw on philosophical inquiry, leading to a couple of open-ended questions that I hope you will take home. The term collective action is often used interchangeably with social movement. In this social movement usage, CA will bring to mind some historical events. For example, the women's suffrage movement for voting rights in New Zealand over a century ago in 1893, China's May 4th movement in 1919 to scrape unequal treaties imposed on China and to push for sweeping changes in language, science, democracy, government, and women's status. After World War II, the world has seen India's decolonization from British rule, the Civil Rights Movement that influenced the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the USA, the anti-war movement leading to the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam, and the desegregation movement to end apartheid in South Africa. In the past 2 decades, the world has also seen the emergence of the youth climate movement, the reducitarian movement to eat less meat, and the Global South movement to end vaccine apartheid. We have lived through good times and bad times. Lawrence von Steen coined the term social movement in his 1848 book, Socialist and Communist Movements since the Third French Revolution. In the book, he developed the concept of social movement to moderate the polarizations between the political left and right emerging at his time. Social movement was supposed to offer a political realism to avoid the fallacies of liberalism in unbound individualism and to prevent the consequences of incessant proletarian struggles and revolutions in capitalism. When it is conceptualized in this way, social movement carries the expectation that it is a politically realistic platform for making peaceful social progress. Such an expectation is evident in the missions and deeds of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, psychology's most high-profile fraternity for pursuing collective action over the past 70 years. The same expectations will resonate through everything I have to say today. To quote from Mahatma Gandhi, "It is my conviction that nothing enduring can be built on violence. The only safe way to overcome an enemy is to make of the enemy a friend." Social movements tend to involve a lot of participants and extend over weeks, if not months or years. By contrast, collective action as a general term also covers smaller episodes of shorter duration, such as customer boycott or homeless citizens sleeping outside Parliament House. CA is defined in this talk as group-based politicized actions to redress group grievances or push for wider organizational, community, and global betterment. Now, let me explain some of the key terms. CA is collective in the sense that participants are acting as members of a group that is real and physical, or psychological and imaginary. And it is group-based. CA is politicized in the sense that participants are challenging those in power to redress group grievances or push for wider social changes. In empirical studies, CA participation is usually measured by several responses, including self-report of past participation in CA, intention to do so, as well as attitudinal support of CA. And now, a couple of historical trends. How successful and frequent are CAs? Now, I don't know the answer in general. A limited and partial answer comes from a survey of particularly large, protracted, and serious CAs between 1940 to 2016 by Chenoweth. The survey found that the success rates of violent CA were generally low. We can see this from a blue curve in the slide. Non-violent CAs, the orange curve, were relatively more successful, reaching a high 70% in the 1990s. Since then, their success has declined. However, despite losing effectiveness in the past 3 decades, non-violent CAs have remained more popular than violent CAs. We can see this from the tall orange bars near the right end of the lower panel of the slide. These historical trends contradict the view that CAs are generally violent. The fact of the matter is that non-violence has overtaken violence and remained as the prevalent mode of response, despite losing effectiveness in recent decades. One wonders if non-violence can continue to prevail, or if its supporters will lose confidence in it and turn to violence instead. To understand why people participate in CA, it will not be enough to know only why they engage in CA per se. We also have to understand why would they give up alternative forms of action. Two theoretical frameworks that take up both tasks are the exit voice thesis and social identity theory. In the face of declining products or services provided by a shop or organization, customers and members may elect one of two basic modes of response, which Albert Hirschman called exit and voice. Some may take a personal decision and stop patronizing the shop, or leave the organization to find something better elsewhere. This is the exit option. Or they may express their dissatisfaction either to management or to some other authorities to which management is subordinate, in a hope of improving the product or service. This is the voice option, and Hirschman called it political action par excellence. Individual exit by definition is not CA. Group voice is. Its social function is to serve as a recuperating mechanism to enable the shop or organization recover from decline. Individual exit, by contrast, has the opposite effect of draining from the shop or organization is more quality conscious, alert, and potentially activist customers or members. Independent of the exit voice thesis, Henri Tajfel developed a social identity theory of social change and intergroup behavior. It coincides with the exit voice thesis at some point, but differs in others. According to the theory, members of a group who are disaffected, unsatisfied, or feeling disadvantaged will respond somewhere along a belief continuum. The closer they are to the social mobility end of the belief continuum, the more likely they will individually exit from the group to join a more advantageous or prestigious group. They will stick to this belief when they perceive the boundary of the group and the boundary of the desired group are both open and permeable, to allow them leave the group freely and to offer them better opportunities elsewhere. Now, what happens when the group boundaries are actually closed and impermeable? The society is not as free or open as they think it is. They will begin to doubt the social mobility belief and shift towards social change belief when they also become aware of cognitive alternatives to the system or status quo. For example, when they see the status quo should be changed because it is illegitimate, or can be changed because it is now unstable. When group impermeability, system illegitimacy, and system instability combine to radicalize people's behavior and belief towards social change, that belief will lead them to participate in CA. The more they identify with the disadvantaged group, the more obligated they are to act as exemplary or prototypical group members in supporting CA and disavowing individual mobility. In a nutshell, social identity theory proposes that system illegitimacy, system instability, and particularly group member social identity are what motivate group members to opt for CA instead of personal self-improvement. These three major factors are highlighted red in the slide. The theory offers a more systematic explanation than the exit voice thesis of why people join or support the CA, and has stimulated lots of experimental, observational, and qualitative studies sufficient to set the stage for research to move to the next stage of integrating the various findings. A major integrated social identity model of CA was published in 2008 by Van Zoomerang et al. It was based on a meta-analysis of over 180 effects of illegitimacy, instability, and identity on CA participation. The researchers proposed two conceptual revisions of social identity theory in order to form a model that will provide the best fit of the data. These are summarized in the slide. First, the injustice currently felt by participants would be a better predictor than system structural illegitimacy. Second, the power or political aspect of system instability and identity should be emphasized, respectively, as group power advocacy and politicized identity. An example of politicized identity would be the identification with the social movement, whereas the identification with a disadvantaged group would be an example of social identity. Of the three predictors, injustice and advocacy impacted CA participation only directly, whereas politicized identity impacted participation directly and also indirectly through its impact on injustice and advocacy. The researchers explained the dominant role of politicized identity as follows, quote, politicized identity helps relatively powerless individuals to perceive and emotionally experience incidental and structural disadvantages as unjust, as well as to feel empowered in order to change those in power, end quote. The 2008 model was revisited in a recent meta-analysis that reviewed a much larger set of studies and included cross-cultural comparisons. In this project, Agostini and Van Zoomerang, 2021, made use of moral psychology and system justification research to propose that morality should be considered as equally important as politicized identity. Now, what is the rationale? The rationale is that moral convictions can powerfully divide the content of identity, such as when a moral belief that education should be free to all fits with students' identity, and consequently will strengthen their participation in a CA aimed at lowering student fees. The results replicated the earlier 2008 model. Furthermore, it showed that by integrating morality, the new model performed better in terms of a superior model fit. However, the improvement was actually quite marginal, and the explained variance for CA participation remained the same as 27%. This might simply reflect the psychological reality that morality has largely been absorbed as part of politicized identity, adding little to what politicized identity has already explained. The real contribution of morality lies elsewhere, I think. You see, morality by its very nature has a relatively universal application that transcends the narrow identification with a particular local group. White Americans who moralize equality and freedom from racial discrimination may act in solidarity with blacks to support civil rights movement, although such movements would actually undermine the relative advantage and privileges of the group membership and consequently the superiority of the social identity as white Americans. Moralizing may therefore mobilize popular support from groups that normally don't self-categorize as members of the CA group, leading to the emergence of a common in-group identity that in turn would forge a new sense of intergroup understanding and cooperation among unconnected groups. Sociologist Imar Durkheim, in his 1912 classic, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, refer to this as the powers of morality to bind individuals together and to build groups with emergent new identities and properties. To conclude, the systematic integrations of separate studies have injected power and morality into the theorizing of CA participation. They offer a relatively complete account of why people choose CA and not individual mobility. However, they have a little to say about the moment by moment or day by day unfolding of the course of a CA to review how a CA may proceed peacefully or turn violent. We now move on to a discussion of the violent turn in some CAs. Episodes of violence that are apparently rigged or due to infiltration or subversion will be excluded from our discussion. To explain the violent turn will require a theory that can explain what causes violence as well as explaining what eventually allows or disinhibits violent acts. Now, let me illustrate this important point with an example. Back in the 1970s, experiments by Henri Transfer and others have found that the mere division of participants into anonymous groups on some ad hoc, trivial basis was sufficient to cause them to allocate more monetary points to their group than to the other group, even if this would mean giving both groups less money than what was available. The cause was so incredibly minimal and was explained in terms of participants' desire to differentiate the in-group from the out-group positively, to make it more superior for them to identify with and feel proud of. However, the explanation has addressed only half of the problem. The other half of the problem was embedded in experimental setting and therefore has not surfaced, requiring an explanation. This was because the eventual discrimination was in fact permitted by a particular type of intergroup power relationship set up unknowingly by the experimenter as a simple matter of experimental procedure. By giving the participants a unilateral and useful power to determine how much to allocate to the in-group and out-group with no fear of retaliation or need to justify it. When I changed the unilateral power relations to a bilateral one, or made it less secure, discrimination was replaced by equal allocation. Now, that was some 40 years ago. Before that, Churchill in 1974 had already recognized the power of political dimension in his pioneering formulation of social identity theory. Rediscovering the power dimensions in recent years has contributed much to the development of integrated models of why people participate in CA, as we have already seen. The theoretical significance of explaining what allows or disinhibits physical violence will become apparent as we go along. Collins' micro-sociology has a particular theory of violence. In this theory, it takes up the two explanatory requirements. The theory sees violence as situation process and stresses the here and now of an unfolding confrontational situation. In contrast, the background conditions that may be necessary but insufficient to cause violence. It is therefore different from the frustration aggression theory and other similar theories. To analyze the moment-by-moment emotional dynamics, Collins recreated confrontational violence situations in military combats, crowd violence, sports violence, domestic abuse, school and prison bullying by piecing together ethnographic observations and recordings. Violent interactions recorded on videos were particularly useful for revealing emotional gestures and voices, facial expressions and emotions, and bodily movement, how individuals enter into or retreat from a fight, charge forward or run away, or simply freeze in horror. This allowed Collins to understand how emotional dynamics would disinhibit violence in an actual situation without relying on the catharsis or release of pent-up frustrations. According to his theory, violence is difficult, not easy or automatic to enact, since confrontation raises bodily tensions and inhibit physical action. Actors fear getting hurt and hurting others. Let me quote. Whatever the motive or interest the individuals or groups might have for fighting, the overriding reality is that most of the time they do not fight. They pretend to get along, they compromise, they put up a peaceful facade and maneuver behind the scenes. They bluff, buster, insult, and gossip, more often at the distance than to the opponent's face. When they do come to violence, the determining conditions are overwhelmingly in their short-term interactions, end quote. Only if these people are pushed over this inhibition threshold would they act violently. Where would the pushover come from? It comes from emotional dynamics in the situation. Following Collins' lead, Anne Nashua integrated Collins' emotional dynamics with behavioral dynamics into a two-stage model of the violent turn. Based on a sample of 30 global justice movement protests in the USA and Germany since 1999. 18 protests turned violent and 12 remained peaceful. The emotional dynamics that push protesters or police over the inhibition threshold begin with the building up of tension and fear in a violence-threatening confrontations between them. Note that in a violent situation, it is fear, but not anger, that emerge at this particular stage. I will return to this point later on. What happens next is pivotal. Now let me quote. Whether both sides maintain an emotional equilibrium, or whether a turning point occurs in which one side establishes emotional dominance over the other is critical, end quote. What does emotional dominance mean? It refers to the situationally weak and the situationally dominant actors and can be established regardless of whether the actor has a physical advantage or not. It does not lead to violence in all situations, but only in a confrontational situation of higher tension and fear. In the absence of such a confrontation, emotional dominance may simply arise from the massive turnout of supporters swelling the marching column, the singing of spirited songs, etc., which would be associated with feeling high, but not physical violence. In the behavioral dynamic stage, Nashor identifies 3 behavioral paths to violence for understanding how emotional dynamics will emerge from the actions of protesters and police officers. The paths are made up of 2 or more or 5 behaviors in various combinations. Spatial incursion is present in all violence paths as shown in the slide. It occurs when protesters or police advance into the other side's space. For example, when protesters break through police line, or when police enter protesters' assembly compound. Incursion threatens the basic human need of security and upsets the equilibrium of power relations between police and protesters, escalating confrontational tensions and fear to a new high. In the confusion, a protester or a police officer may fall over or is being outnumbered. The situational weakness in one side induces a sense of emotional dominance for aggression in the other side. This emotional outburst of collective power is nicely described by Collins as follows. Let me quote from Collins again. Successful violence patterns on confrontational tension fear as one side appropriates the emotional rhythm as denominator and the other gets caught in it as the victim, end quote. Now, there is a gap in Nashor's model of emotional behavioral dynamics. The model is supposed to understand the violent trend in protester-police confrontations. The confrontations are obviously intergroup. They are between protesters and police, yet the intergroup nature of violence remains underdeveloped in her studies. To fill this gap, we turn to social psychological intergroup research. First, intergroup emotions theory. This theory by Mackey and others has shown, in line with social identity theory, that when social identity is salient, individuals are not necessarily personally concerned with the situation or the event. Instead, they experience emotions because the group may get hurt or helped by it. Emotions are then experienced on behalf of the in-group, and the in-group and out-group become the centers of emotion. When the in-group is appraised as strong, the opponent group no longer appears fearsome. This emboldens group members and turns the prior feelings of fear into anger towards the opponent group. From this intergroup emotion perspective, one may explain Nashor's finding that fear and not anger built up in violence-threatening situations, and that is because the opponent group is appraised as stronger, or at least as strong as the in-group. One may also explain the power of emotional dominance. Emotional dominance comes about coincidental with the emergence of a new empowered identity. This latter point is demonstrated in a second intergroup perspective. It has been inspired by the social identity model of crowds developed by Russia and others. For example, Stott studied a crowd event in London that began as a protest demonstration. Despite an initial phase of explicitly rejected conflict and little or no conflict, it later developed into a riot involving some 5,000 people attacking the police, who were actually not responsible for the attacks. The temporal events revealed the changes in the perceived power relationship between crowd participants and the police preceded physical attacks on the police. Following police interventions with the demonstration, demonstrators increasingly perceive conflict with the police as proper social action. Those who have categorized themselves as part of this new subgroup would have felt supported in the action by others, since everyone else around them were perceived as similar to self and hence to feel the same way. The author cited interview extracts such as the following to illustrate feelings of empowerment in a new identity. Quote, "The crowd went forward because there were so many people and there was quite a strong feeling of power being in such a big group. And like I said, I felt I had the right to be here." End quote. The conclusion is that a newly empowered identity has evolved from the intergroup interaction. Now, this conclusion was corroborated in another ethnological study of the emergence of violence in a British nationwide environmental campaign. The parallel between intergroup emotions and empowered identity on the one hand, and Nashor's emotional and behavioral dynamics on the other, is striking and begs theoretical integration. I think this would be an exciting area of future research. Now, what can be done about the violent turn? In an age of incessant complaints, CAs are sometimes misused for pretentious causes disproportional to the social disruptions that they cause. The eruption of violence causing bloodshed, casualties, and police arrests add to skepticism of CAs in some quarters of the population. Some blame the protesters, others blame the police, and still others put the blame on foreign interference. Along the way, the arguments and allegations rip through families and society. Should CAs be banned? I think not. The reality is that with sagging voter turnout and declining public trust in mainstream institutional political engagement, there is a market for CAs as a form of expressing public concern. Contrary to some opinions, the violent turn in CAs does not necessarily reduce public support for CA. CAs will remain a useful mechanism of social recuperation, less accepted in tight societies, more in loose societies, and vastly more popular among younger and older citizens. A realistic and responsible approach would be to find ways to avert or mitigate the violent turns of CAs. How can this be done? There is a red line running through the general theory of violence and situation process, the microanalysis of emotional and behavioral dynamics, the intergroup emotions theory, and social identity theory of crowds that we have discussed. This red line points to the power of the situation. Once a protest march gets into a confrontation situation, usually triggered by spatial incursions, the situation gets a collective momentum impacting on protesters and police, regardless of how nice a person they think they are, and despite their goodwill towards one another. Countering the power of the situation may therefore avert the violent turn. How? First and foremost, avoid spatial incursions. Protesters and police alike should respect others' space and honor the agreed marching route. Second, they should resist the transient euphoria of emotional dominance and identity empowerment when a confrontation situation has already developed. The sense of power in a confrontation situation of tension and fear is a dangerously destructive power. Let it go. When confrontations and conflict have already started, the police can mitigate the situations by recognizing that protesters are not all the same. Some of them may act in ways that the police won't permit and are prepared to confront the police to achieve their aims. The majority of protesters generally will identify with groups that have entirely legal aims and intentions, with police officers treat them the same as the transgressive minority. This will impose a common fate on them and induce them to cohere as a unified psychological group against the police. A better way to police diversity among protesters is to facilitate this majority to continue in the peaceful march so the officers will avoid confronting them and keep them from being dragged into the violent path of the minority. This allows peaceful participants to categorize themselves along with the police in opposition to violent factions rather than the other way around. Another way to mitigate the violent turn is by dialogue-based policing, carried out by police liaison officers. The limitation of this dialogue is that the more transgressive protesters will not change simply by dialogue, and instead perceive the real aim of dialogue as collecting intelligence for making arrests later. Dialogue will not alter that. But if liaison teams accept that and are prepared to tolerate some disruption, then they might improve mutual understanding and reduce the potential for violence. Police tolerance, however, can only be carried out effectively if liaison teams have the authority to directly instruct frontline officers to tolerate disruptions. This condition may not exist because the overarching strategy of policing is often based on deploying an iron fist of zero tolerance along the velvet glove of the liaison teams. From the police perspective, an iron fist is justified in order to maintain public order, or because they perceive that extremists and activists should only be met by an iron fist. The success of the multiple approaches to avert or mitigate violence is relatively restricted by the specific context in which they are applied. They are also ethically controversial, especially in the case of dialogue-based policing. We should recognize that from the perspective of protesters, what they really want is to enter into a dialogue with the relevant organizations or government authority who alone is in a position to address the demands, not the police. The kind of dialogue at this level of dialoguing is unlike the dialogue in the so-called dialogue policing. The concept of genuine dialogue would be useful here. Martin Buber, philosopher and religious activist, wrote about genuine dialogue in the 1920s and 1930s. When I first studied his works, I was looking for insights into what kind of communications would make genuine dialogue. I found very little of that. And then I realized that genuine dialogue is much more than communications. Perhaps I've started from the wrong end. For Buber, genuine dialogue begins as an attitude. It must come from an I-thou attitude, in which each side treats the other as a wholesome you, a thou, instead of an object, it. Such an attitude is in turn part of a bigger picture of human existence, in which humans do not exist as isolated individuals or as a collective, but in the form of a human being with a human being in the sphere of between. Through an I-thou attitude, partners in a genuine dialogue established a world of combinations or relations. Thou is used instead of you to signify spiritual intimacy, experiencing and empathizing the other. This genuine dialogue relationship, in which two persons enter into a relationship as I and thou, is the product of a community, not a collective or a bundle of isolated individuals. An attitude based on I-it, on the other hand, is very different from the I-thou attitude. It gives rise to a world of separation in which an aloof I contemplates the other person as an it, expressed in terms of the psychological notion of dehumanizing. The I in the I-it dialogue denies humanness to the other person, treating him or her as a subhuman animal or non-human object, and it for short. Social psychological research by Heston and others has shown that dehumanization is associated with intergroup contexts that separate us from them. If the dialogue between protesters and authority occurs in an us versus them context, the I-it attitude would dominate. The genuine form of dialogue will come about only if the two sides redefine the us versus them categorization in such a way that the I-it attitude will give way to the I-thou attitude. Now, how may this come about? One possible way is for the two sides develop a functional common in-group identity to replace the us versus them polarization. This common in-group identity, according to Gaynor et al., should be functional for both sides, and is not necessarily a single superordinate identity, which would actually privilege the more powerful side, such as the authority. The authority have a vested interest in constructing a single group social representation to cover up disparities between them and protesters, so as to soften the demand of protesters and to talk them out of protesting. Protesters, on the other hand, prefer a dual identity within an overall group representation in which members of the different groups remain identifiable, preserve their distinctiveness, draw attention to group disparities, and mobilize both sides to pursue the common good. The much quoted words of Governor Hobson of New Zealand, back at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, sum up the functionality of common in-group identity very well. His words, he, iwi, tahi, tautu, which are often mistranslated as we are one people, are actually we are many peoples making one nation. Now the big picture. Buber expanded on the ideal dialogue in his later writings by relating it to the bigger picture of human existence. He talked about a life of dialogue, not just genuine dialogue, and proposed that a fundamental fact of human existence is a human being with a human being. One human being turning to another as another in order to communicate with him or her in a sphere which is common to both of them, but which goes beyond the specific sphere of each one of them. Buber called this sphere the sphere of between. Although it can be realized in very different degrees, it is a primal category of human reality. This is where the genuine third alternative to the other two categories of human existence must begin. One of the other two categories of human existence is existence as isolated individuals, corresponding to the sphere of individualism. Another category is existence as collective, corresponding to the sphere of collectivism. Individualism and collectivism, according to Buber, are incomplete forms of human existence. Individualism understands only a part of humanity and hence distorts humanity. Collectivism understands humanity only as a part and hence puts a mask over humanity. None can advance to the wholesome of a woman or a man, to each as one whole, which can only be realized in the sphere of between. Thus, genuine dialogue is part of a life of dialogue. It is this life of dialogue that provides the overall human framework for seizing a conflict, making a truce for peace, agreeing on a reform, etc., etc. It is remarkable that these philosophical ideas from the 1920s and 1930s would sound so similar to contemporary cultural psychology and cross-cultural psychology. In recent decades, these branches of psychology have broadened the understanding of human behavior and consciousness by revealing the narrow Western-centric individualist bias in much of mainstream psychology, calling attention to collectivism in many other parts of the world. Subsequent advances have in turn corrected the earlier simplistic conception of collectivism, and this together with the rise of indigenous psychology in East Asia and elsewhere, has led to an understanding of the fundamental importance of human connectedness in a holistic process of nature and interpersonal harmony. In one sense, these branches of psychology are rediscovering Buber's ideas independently, and in turn have provided an invariable interpretation of some of his ideas. In social psychology, the notion of dehumanization furnishes an understanding of the I-it attitude linked to an us versus them mentality. Similarly, the functional common in-group identity model comes closer than the earlier idea of single group common identity in offering a more nuanced understanding of Buber's idea of the sphere of between. It would be interesting to explore more deeply how the two sets of ideas may inform each other. Now it's time to conclude. For Buber, genuine dialogue, experiencing the other side, wholesome existence, and the sphere of between are all aspects of living a life of dialogue. This life is part of our birthright as human beings. Only through it can be attained authentic human existence. Yet, living a life of dialogue seems too remote from our busy daily lives, too realistic, too hard, and hence totally unrealistic. Shall we give up on it or find ways of learning how to get on with it? The contemporary world is characterized by mass mobilization and instant messaging powered by the internet and social media. It has shown more vividly than before the challenges presented by CAs that have collective groups and multiple aims, but no clear leadership. With whom can authorities dialogue, even if they would, who have the right and duty to sit on the dialogue chairs? On this note, I bring my talk to a close, in the hope that the open-ended questions will continue ringing in these difficult times. Thank you for listening. Good health, fine spirit, and God bless.